Welcome to the Archaeology Studio. Today's episode considers archaeology in J.R.R. Tolkien's legendary fantasy world of Middle-earth. Tolkien created a sense of realism in Middle-earth's rich history of its people, folklore, languages, and landscapes. Tolkien did not write about archaeology, yet he portrayed Middle-earth in a manner that was compatible with a perspective of archaeology. Tolkien's most famous published works of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy concentrated on sets of events during the lifetimes of specific characters, while the larger setting and context of Middle-earth referred to deep historical time. The stories offered various hints and clues about how Middle-earth came to exist and how it developed through an incredibly long time scale that could interface with archaeology. Tolkien's appendices and other works have revealed exceptional details about the history of Middle-earth. Even without reading all of this material, people can appreciate how the extensive contextual and historical information resulted in a realistic setting of Middle-earth. In other words, the setting in The Hobbit and in the Lord of the Rings trilogy became so realistic because of all of Tolkien's deeper work behind the scenes in creating an elaborate backstory. When the characters, such as Frodo Baggins and others, explored different parts of Middle-earth, then they encountered relics and ruins of towers, statues, tombs, and other constructions from ancient time periods, still surviving in the landscape that they observed during their lifetimes. Tolkien himself was familiar with a landscape in England and in Europe that incorporated the physical remnants from multiple layers of the medieval era, the earlier Roman Empire, and older periods. When Tolkien wrote about an approximately Iron Age through medieval setting in his Middle-earth, then he accounted for how this landscape and historical context already had been shaped and influenced by older time periods. Tolkien's construction of Middle-earth included a history that extended back more than 50,000 years. The shape of the world's terrain had changed through its different periods of the years of the lamps, years of the trees, and then the First Age through Fourth Age. Most of the events, as portrayed in The Hobbit and in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, were situated toward the end of the Third Age. By that time, diverse populations and civilizations had emerged, transformed, and declined. In Tolkien's view of Middle-earth, ancient events continued to shape and influence the world in waves or ripples that could repeat, perhaps in different forms and perhaps many centuries or even millennia later. Thematically, Tolkien was concerned with how the forces of nature, good and evil, could persist through time, transforming through variable strengths and weaknesses while the larger world continued to change as well. As part of making this theme effective and realistic in his fictional writing, Tolkien constructed the extensive timeline of Middle-earth with reference to several events throughout natural history and cultural history. Given the thematic focus of Tolkien's stories in Middle-earth, the imaginary backstory of historical context was far deeper than would have been necessary in most other works of fiction. Usually in a piece of literature, a backstory accounts for the lifetimes of the central acting characters, and any older time periods are irrelevant or inconsequential. The sense of deeper history made Middle-earth into its own realistic world, where the long-term perspectives of ancient history and archaeology could be applied. If a place like Middle-earth actually existed, then an archaeologist conceivably could study the ancient sites, artifacts, and layers extending back several thousands of years. Tolkien's writing even gave examples of the kinds of ancient ruins and artifacts that might be discovered. For literary purposes, Tolkien's Middle-earth seems to have existed primarily, but not necessarily entirely, during an Iron Age through medieval context. This time frame in our reality extended over some centuries, but it was sustained for several millennia in the fictional world of Middle-earth. In other words, a short window of time in our world was extended over a much longer time scale in Tolkien's Middle-earth. The greater time scale of Middle-earth gave Tolkien unique opportunities in literary and narrative devices. As a result, if we want to impose our world's reality of archaeology into the fantasy setting of Middle-earth, then first we will need to consider the implications of a greatly extended Iron Age through medieval context, spanning over some thousands of years. In our reality, the ancient sites and artifacts of the Iron Age were not too much different from each other, and likewise the records of the medieval period were largely similar for each segment of a few hundred years. For instance, the materials of the so-called Viking Age in England were mostly consistent throughout a period of 350 years, roughly AD 800 through 1150. In terms of basic material inventory, chronological differences can be discerned in large blocks of time, of at least a few centuries each. Continuing with this example in England, the Viking Age can be differentiated from the much older Roman era of the years AD 43 through 410. In Tolkien's Middle-earth, an archaeologist might discover much the same inventory of stonework architecture, iron tools, weapons, and other remnants in time periods separated by hundreds or maybe thousands of years, especially for the time span of Tolkien's First Age through Fourth Age. When looking at the abandoned ruins of 3 or 4 separate sites, the material inventories would look mostly the same. The only differences would be detectable in the styles of artistic expressions that could have developed simply as localized traditions and not necessarily as the results of chronological change. Unless someone could excavate and expose different stratigraphic layers of sites and artifacts, then a chronological order would be difficult to decode among these site records that looked mostly the same as each other. In this case, the chronology of sites in Middle-earth possibly could be inferred through studies of stylistic attributes of artifacts and architecture, occasional written inscriptions, possible historical references in coins or iconography, and perhaps the degree of weathering or decay of different objects. In the real world of Iron Age through medieval contexts, most archaeological sites have been visible on or near the ground surface. Excavations, of course, have exposed exceptional details, but the locations and major features can be detected through surface surveys, inspection of aerial imagery, and familiarity with historical maps and archives. Additional information can be gathered through metal detection and other remote sensing, given the fact that most of the sites of this time range contain dense and durable materials of metals, glass, high-fired ceramic items, and other creations in concentrated patterns. More lines of evidence can be gathered through the traditional names of places, with reference to historical events and contexts. Overall, sites of the Iron Age through medieval periods are much easier to identify and contextualize than would be the case for older sites. Not only because those older sites could be buried more deeply beneath the ground, but also because they contained less durable traces of stone and bone tools, friable, low-fired earthenware fragments, less extravagant stonework and earthwork features, and little or no connection with folklore and language traditions. Many sites of the Iron Age through medieval periods were occupied for limited durations of a few centuries or less. Whenever a house or other structure grew old and started to decay, then people tended to abandon it and create a new construction in a different location. The result was a landscape full of the degraded ruins and reminders of older periods. Wood, thatch, and textiles disintegrated after some years, and the surviving durable components were the elements of stonework architecture, along with pieces of metal, glass, and high-fired ceramic products. Even those items would have become weathered, fragmented, and disaggregated after some time. Earthwork constructions of mounds and roads would have become overgrown with vegetation rapidly, certainly unusable or inaccessible after just a few years. The vestiges of the abandoned sites still could be detected in the landscape, but they would not have been active parts of daily activities. Eventually, knowledge about the abandoned sites would fade in its relevance for later generations of people. Gradually, the objective historical details would transform more into folklore that required a different mode of interpretation. Much of the history of the Iron Age through medieval periods could be studied simply through exploring a landscape and learning about the folklore and traditions associated with its named places. Tolkien was familiar with this kind of landscape. Additionally, he was aware that some locations were used and reused repeatedly, such as seen in the multiple layers of settlements in London and other places. With these observations, Tolkien created his imaginary world of Middle-earth, and the result was in many ways consistent with the reality of history and archaeology. If someone could investigate the archaeology of the First Age through Fourth Age of Middle-earth, then a large part of this work could be accomplished through the same techniques as would be used for studying the Iron Age through medieval period in our world. The major difference, however, would be the much longer time depth in Middle-earth. In this respect, the possibility for deep subsurface excavations would need to be considered more seriously. In the real world, most sites after 1,000 years have become at least partially buried beneath new sedimentary layers. Most sites after 2,000 years have become entirely buried. Even in the places of large stonework ruins that obtrude above the ground levels of those sites have become buried beneath a matrix of rubble, sedimentary buildup, and vegetation. Another problem for archaeology in Middle-earth involves how to study the most ancient periods prior to Tolkien's First Age. The years of the lamps and the years of the trees referred to different configurations of ancient landforms. Studies of those older periods would require an approach of paleolandscape research combined with archaeology. The extensive backstory of Middle-earth has enabled the possibility of imagining what an archaeological study might look like. Furthermore, at least some knowledge of archaeology in general can offer more insight and appreciation of Tolkien's Middle-earth. In concluding this episode, I encourage for you to consider more about how archaeology and ancient history might be represented in Tolkien's Middle-earth or in other fantasy settings. You can evaluate the realism, and you can evaluate the relationship with the literary and artistic themes. Please remember to subscribe to this channel, tell your friends about it, and see new videos every month with the Archaeology Studio.